Hi, hope you're well and thriving this week, and if not, hi anyway. Sofia Coppola, to me, is one of the best nepotism has to offer the film industry, and I love a lot of her movies, even if there is a fair few that I have not watched. Though I did finally get around to watching Lost in Translation recently, which did kind of inspire this video. She makes excellent movies that look incredible and have a soft, clear, dreamy, and palpably feminine quality to them. Many of her movies, I think, share like a refined elegance about them, even when depicting things that are like far from that. And due to that, I did grow up with the mood boards and Pinterest pins of that aesthetic, which exude like a sort of clearly girly orientated vibe. Whether or not they were curated by weird racist teens on the internet, I can't say. But also, another reason I really wanted to make this video is because of her like daughter's bonkers TikTok. I thought that was so funny, and just rich people have indescribably funny lives that do inspire me a little bit. So firstly, we have Spring Snow by Yukiya Mishima. This was already on my TBR list, so that was a win for me. I get to tick this off when I read it, as well as the fact that Mishima is a kind of a prolific and notorious author in kind of every sense of that word. So I think reading something by him is necessary, at least to me. Plus, I've never read anything that is historical or classic set in Japan, but I'm not actually sure whether this is a Japanese classic or something that Westerners think is a classic. Generally, I've just stuck to contemporary Japanese fiction, and this novel instead is set in Tokyo in 1912 and follows the story of Kyoki Matsuge, who is kind of torn between his love and his loyalty to the Japanese aristocracy. And that's kind of the thing that I'm most like excited to learn about when reading this. It's like how Japanese society worked at the time, because I had no idea. Like, aside from one graphic novel that I had to read for uni and the Bill Wurtz video, The History of Japan, I've got no clue, especially for anything like before 1950s, sort of like westernizing Japan. I have like no idea about Japan, honestly. So I'm excited to know about that. So next up is The Hawkline Monster by Richard Brautigan. The novel is a gothic western about two gunmen who are hired by a woman to kill a monster that lives in the ice caves under her house. I don't know what an ice cave is, so that's gonna be fun to learn about. And things kind of, I think, become strange when the gunmen begin to realise that the monster may not be what they think it is. It's actually meant to be a parody of both gothic novels and westerns, and seems to have combined both genres to do so. And as someone who doesn't really like westerns but does like gothic fiction, I'm kind of interested to see how that manifests itself here. But yeah. And thirdly, we have Music for Torching by A.M. Holmes. This follows a dysfunctional family that wants to make things good again. Not in like a MAGA way, but like just generally. I assume it's about the faults of suburbia, and the Wall Street Journal actually calls it a sly, fast-paced and darkly comic novel about a suburban marriage that's going to hell fast. In my experience, stories about suburbia are either a complete win or a real loss with me, so I'm gonna hope it ends up being the former. So yeah, those are the three that I'm thinking of reading, and I'm crossing my fingers that I kind of come out of this still respecting Sofia Coppola. Kind of lovely twist of fate, the Priscilla teaser trailer dropped, and that is Sofia Coppola's new movie, and I am highly like surprised that it dropped already. So I wasn't sure when it was coming out, but it looks great. It looks serene, it looks beautiful, it looks dreamy, it looks like it's actually going to show Elvis to be a predator for once. I liked the Baz Luhrmann Elvis movie. Baz Luhrmann is one of my faves. I know a lot of people don't like him. For me though, he's a winner. I like watching his movies. However, I do think Elvis is like made out to be the good person in that movie. Like, he's the one being exploited, but obviously being a victim of exploitation doesn't mean that you can also not be like a bad person. So I like that this is going to have Priscilla's take on it. I've heard Priscilla likes this, like the movie, instead of kind of what's generally been said about her. So I'm excited that this kind of coincides with what she wants her like narrative to actually be. Plus, I think Sofia Coppola is going to do a really good job because, whilst I don't know, I think Sofia Coppola has issues with like race. This is depicting the exploitation of a white woman, and I do think she's going to do that the justice that it deserves. So yeah, I'm excited to see it. It looks beautiful, and I have a feeling it's going to be good. Jacob Elordi as Elvis is interesting. I don't know, I don't see him as Elvis that much, but I know that he knows how to play a weird, abusive creep really well. You know, I have seen season 1 of Euphoria at least. So, yeah, I have my thoughts.
Several days later.
And so the debrief begins. And in reading order, we have Spring Snow first. The aspect I liked the most about this was what I thought it was going to be, and that was learning and reading about the aristocracy of Japan. It's honestly a little confusing, at least to me, because of the translation, as noble titles can sort of change place by place. So there is a marquis and a count, and whereas the count comes from like old proper aristocracy, the marquis is from an old respected samurai family that have been given new titles since the old ways of Japan have sort of like started falling away. Yet usually a marquis is of a higher rank than a count, I think, but here the count is more highly revered because of his age-old position, although the marquis in the novel has more money than the count, which is like a point of contention. I'm much more in tune with like British royalty than anything else, so I tried to rationalise it that way. It's sort of like the Count's family are broke Featheringtons, and the Marquis is like the Duke or the new people of colour in Bridgerton that were given titles. Bridgerton kind of came into clutch here to just understand. I'm going to assume that the Marquis or the Count thing is not a problem in the original, as I think the Marquis's like Japanese title is probably something that cannot be like translated directly and is probably very deeply cultural. Regardless, the Random House vintage imprint tried their best. This book is a romance tragedy, however, the romance doesn't really start until like halfway through, not because they don't meet, and not because we're tied up on many other interesting plot lines, but because Kyoki, the main character, spends so much time blathering on and on and on about how much he doesn't like Satoko, who is the love interest in the story, because she has a crush on him. He spends most of the novel pining for something more in his life and yearning to not have to follow the life that is set for him. And this kind of also bleeds into his like initial discontent with Satoko, where he implies that he would rather be with a princess instead, or like the princess in the story. But he doesn't actually have any personal ambitions of his own. Like, the book flips perspectives a lot, and we focus on Kyoki's friend as well, sporadically, and his name is Honda, like the car. I was also bewildered by the fact that his name was Honda, even though Honda is a Japanese car brand, and that name obviously came from somewhere. And Honda, in comparison to Koki, actually has like life goals. He seems to like actually want to pursue something. Whether this is like pushed by his family is secondary, since he seems to actively want this. He's also a character that kind of needs this, since his family is not as noble or rich, so he will need a future job. So that's like kind of why he has a personal ambition. But whenever like Kyoki sort of bemoans his fate, it feels ridiculous because it's not like he's wanted anything in the first place. Like, I think Kyoki is meant to be a symbol of systematic decline in Japan. I think Mishima generally believed that Japan was going through a decline at the time, and his inability to do anything and sort of stay in his place as the world like invariably changed around him sort of referenced this, which is something that Mishima tells us in the novel. I didn't just infer that. That is something that he's super consistent about saying. Kyoki is kind of like a tragedy of his time. He believes in propriety and looks down on infidelity. He really wants to honour his country and aspires for greatness, yet comes off kind of contradictorily as kind of petulant and indecisive instead. Also, if you didn't know, Mishima himself greatly believed in the emperor and the status quo, and further also was definitely involved in a certain good old-fashioned bit of fascism. So I do believe Kyoki is meant to genuinely be like a likeable character, but I don't think fascists know what likeable characters are. And a character who represents the decay of society, or at least what Mishima believed that to be, the sort of decline of aristocratic spirit to something that's much more like merely sort of partial and elegant to the world. All of which sort of happens against like a backdrop of like westernization, which is not subtly portrayed as kind of like a prime reason for the bastardization of like old Japanese ideals. Overall, the romance does kind of like dutifully make up most of the novel, but it's not really about their love, but more about what their choice of like defiance to be together means, like metaphorically against the fading idea of duty in the country, which Mishima actually would eventually take his own life to preserve that kind of duty. But fuck him, he kind of deserved to die. He was a fascist. And now the Hawkline monster. I feel like the cover is so weird. Like, I don't understand what they've done to it. It's like a really old library book. Anyway, I enjoyed this way more than I thought I would. I'm not the biggest Western fan, though I will say I've not ever read one. And even further, I've actually not watched one for like many a year now. I feel like when I was younger, they used to always be on TV and my dad would be watching them. But I guess with like the rise of streaming, my dad just kind of watch every single sport ever instead of watching a 3-hour Western. So he traded one thing I found boring for something else I found boring. He's having fun at least, so good for him. The novel, I think, is incredibly straightforward and very, very fast-paced. And although the book kind of looks big, I feel like with different formatting, it could be way smaller, even like a novella small, you know? The chapters are super short and therefore like very, very easy to fly through. And there's only one through-line plot, so we follow 4 characters and there's like nothing to get confused about. The plot is engaging and lively and mixes gothic with Western in a remarkably whimsical way. It's a very funny novel, and it feels more than anything like an episode of an anthology series. It doesn't really feel like a whole journey with the characters in a way that novels usually feel. It's also not like a stream of conscious or super literary novel with no plot either, so the lack of totality in this novel makes it feel very, very rapid. It feels much more like a short story-esque type thing. I highly recommend reading this if you like Gothic literature, and especially if you've never read any American Gothics. I think this might be a good place to start, even if it is a parody. And most randomly, this book really made me reminisce about MTV's Teen Wolf, and I'm not entirely sure why. I think it's because the monster in this novel feels remarkably like something that would be in Teen Wolf. So again, if that sort of nondescript fantasy with no real rules or magic system sounds fascinating to you, I would recommend picking this up, as it's a very like fun, quick read. And side note, the swearing in this is so modern. Like every time they swear, I'm like, this feels like something that could be so modern. Like I feel like swearing is something that's like in old stories, but in older stories it feels old. Here, every time they use the word fuck, I'm like, oh my god, this feels like something that was written like right now. It takes me off guard every time. So with music for torturing, I'm not sure how I feel. I'm still kind of reeling from it a little. The dysfunction, however, in this book was definitely dysfunctioning, without a doubt. And something that was like special and stood out to me was that usually in stories, I think, about dysfunctional families, the main couple is very like frigid and like stilted with each other. But here, like all of the adults in this novel that we follow are very sexually active, even through like many affairs and personal issues. Like sex is very important to them, which I think was really fresh for the narrative, at least to me. Like neither Elaine or Paul, the main couple, are particularly like inviting or excusable main characters, but Paul is clearly the worst, like horrible, useless husband, whereas Elaine is sort of like a removed, self-pitying wife, which is a better character trait. And spoiler, not really, they burn down their house to kind of like get away from it all, and they just sort of end up back there to sort of like fix it up again, and they just sort of reignite the cycle that they try to move on from. There's a lot of like suburbia corrupts ideology. You know, the novel discusses the idea of comparison and kin-keeping, emotional labour, being unfulfilled in your marriage but then like staying in anyway, and the hardships of like raising children. And I think I'm just like, you know, not the intended audience for this, so I wasn't like wholly on board. I find it kind of boring at times, and I don't think it was entirely original in its matter or themes, so that didn't really help. The ending, on the other hand, is insane. No spoilers, but yeah. So whilst the story is kind of by the by, suburbia rots the brain, this individuality of life is bad, with some sort of like sexual deviancy sprinkled in, the ending is something special, which definitely just like puts it apart from the rest of this kind of genre. It takes you by surprise. I feel like these books were effectively kind of like disjointed. This doesn't feel perhaps as comprehensive as some of the other videos I've done like this, specifically when looking at the tone of each of the books. 2 of these books, though, are about family, which is a recurring theme in her work. And both of these stories end in a sort of resigned way. I won't spoil it, but perhaps that maybe doesn't make for great insight. But there is one big plot point that happens to both of the sons in this book that reinforces this concept that, like, the family simply have to live out their fates and soldier through, like, the worst of times. Both of those sort of, like, imply that the society around them is, like, broken, and the characters are formed by the shards of their, like, respective, like, worlds. And even the Hawkline monster, which is a bit more zany, this also kind of, like, applies to that too, like the end of the book, where the world doesn't really change all that much from how the book kind of started. I would say life in, like, Sofia Coppola's favourite books seem to be kind of stagnant, even when the plot of the novels have kind of, like, cut through the normality to kind of create a sense of vitality in them. And I will say, I think, like, this was definitely sort of represented in her own films, like The Beguiled or The Bling Ring or Lost in Translation. They all kind of end in that way. Some of her other films sort of, like, have a tinge of that idea, but are sort of, like, blindsided by other more important themes, like, you know, the virgin suicides. Those have, like, more prevalent themes in those instead. And whilst I can't deny that Music for Torching was a bit of a slog to get through, I will say I enjoyed reading the others, especially the Hawkline monster, which I don't think I would have even heard of if I hadn't been making this video, so yeah, I'm glad I did read it. Her taste, in my opinion, is mildly questionable, yet, you know, poignant, which sort of makes up for the boredom that comes with some of them. So yeah, read these if you want to, and we can definitely see creators are directly influenced by the work that they consume, and their favourites, in my opinion, do, like, indeed reflect, like, their work, understandably. But yeah, thank you for watching, have a great day, and take care. Bye!